What would you do if your sister called your child a bastard in front of the entire family? I used to think blood relatives were everything, until my sister humiliated my 9-year-old son right on Christmas night. From that day on, my faith was shattered. 6 months later, she paid a very steep price. People say karma spares no one. I didn't believe it until I saw it with my own eyes. Before I get into the details of this story, thanks for choosing my story to listen to today. I hope each day that passes brings you peace and tranquility. Hello everyone, I'm Bennett, a 37-year-old construction project manager living in Denver. The story I'm telling today happened on Christmas night last year, a day when people usually gather together to share words of love and gratitude. But for my family, it became a memorable milestone for every member of the Carter family, where silence and tolerance had gone on too long and became the spark for a war no one saw coming. First, I have to talk about Colton, my 9-year-old son. The kid is everything I have after my ex-wife, Stella, left with her lover 6 years ago. She left Colton when he was only 3, before he could even understand why mom wasn't coming home anymore. Since Stella had a reputation for being unfaithful, some family members used to doubt that Colton was my biological son. The probing looks and subtle questions like who does the kid look like used to drive me crazy. But I don't need a paternity test to know Colton is my son. For me, the unconditional love I have for my child is the true definition of fatherhood. My parents, Richard and Susan Carter, have loved Colton from the very beginning. Mom is especially attached to the kid. She always says, every child is a blessing. Even though some relatives whispered and doubted, my parents never treated their grandson any differently. But there's one person who never accepted that, and that's my sister, Meredith. My sister is 32, single and job-hopping from one nail salon to another. And for almost 2 years now, she's been living in my apartment in Capitol Hill, Denver, without paying a dime in rent. I thought it was just siblings helping each other out during tough times. Looking back now, I was such an idiot. Christmas night last year at my parents' house. After dinner, Colton volunteered to help Grandma wash dishes in the kitchen. The two of them were laughing and joking while working, and the kid was even humming Jingle Bells quietly. I was sitting in the living room talking to Uncle Harold when my phone kept buzzing. When I opened it, my heart felt like someone was squeezing it. In the family group chat with 15 people, Meredith sent a video of Colton washing dishes next to Grandma, with this caption, "Bastards should serve. At least it knows its place. The old lady has someone to wait on her now." The moment I blinked repeatedly to see if I was dreaming, I felt blood rushing to my face. I looked around the living room. Everyone was holding their phones, and all their faces had turned pale. But this cruelty didn't come out of nowhere. It had taken deep root in my sister's subconscious, like a habit, one that had once elevated her, causing her to see herself as the guardian of the Carter family's purity. And to her, Colton was the stain that needed to be exposed in front of everyone. The moment I saw Meredith laughing with delight as she stared at her phone screen, waiting for some fun in the family group chat, memories of all the times she'd poked at Colton kept replaying in my head like a reminder. 3 years ago, on Thanksgiving, when Colton was only 6, he accidentally broke a glass. The kid was terrified, his eyes red as he looked at me, as if he was afraid of getting scolded. But the first person to speak up wasn't me, it was Meredith. She casually dropped this line. Without a mom to teach him, how would he know how to hold things properly? Dad just sighed and said, "Come on, Meredith, clean it up." Not a word of reproach. Not a word defending his grandson. I swallowed my anger because I didn't want to make a big deal on a holiday. Christmas 2 years ago was even better. Colton showed the whole family his math test with an A, his face glowing with pride. Meredith glanced over and dropped this line. "Must be like his mom, just good at acting." That's when I started to realize a harsh truth. My family was choosing peace over protecting a child. And I was also part of the problem by staying silent all the time. But the incident in April was the last straw. That day was Mom's birthday, and the whole family gathered for dinner at my parents' house. Colton had spent an entire week preparing to draw a picture as a gift for Grandma, depicting the two of them holding hands while walking in Acacia Park. The kid was so nervous, kept asking me, "Do you think Grandma will like it?" When Colton gave the picture to Mom, she was moved and hugged him tight. But Meredith laughed mockingly from across the table and said loud enough, "Drawing this badly and still daring to give it as a gift. Must be his mom's genes. Everything half done." Colton's face turned bright red, his eyes welling up. The kid hung his head, his hands gripping his shirt tightly. That was the first time I saw my son hurt so clearly. No longer the confusion of a child who doesn't understand, but the pain of a kid old enough to understand he was being humiliated. Right away, I stood up and pulled Meredith out to the front porch. I looked straight into her eyes and said, "I'm warning you for the last time. If you say one more word about my son like that, don't blame me for going too far. You're living in my apartment, eating with my money. What right do you think you have?" Meredith was really scared then. That kind of blinking eyes, stammering mouth like a fish out of water. She knew full well that if she got kicked out of the apartment, she'd have nowhere to go. She gave a half-hearted apology, promised she wouldn't say anything more. I believed her because I wanted to think that blood still had some conscience left. For the next 8 months, Meredith stayed quiet. I even started thinking I'd been too harsh with my sister, that maybe she was just thoughtless, not malicious. However, the truth was that Meredith was waiting for her chance. She still believed the whole family thought like her, just that no one dared to say it. And she felt that night was the perfect opportunity. And everything exploded in a way no one expected. After that train of thought, I really couldn't stay calm anymore. When I was 10, I once grabbed my sister's hair just because she secretly took my savings to buy candy. But I'm not that impulsive kid anymore. I've learned to control myself and handle everything like an adult. But the moment I saw Meredith prop her feet up on the sofa, hand over her mouth, trying to stifle her laughter while waiting for reactions from the group chat, I thought to myself, this crazy woman must want to meet God early today. If it weren't for the relatives sitting around the living room with the cozy Christmas tree, she probably wouldn't have made it out of that room in one piece. Right when I was about to stand up and walk straight to Meredith, someone was faster than me. Mom came out from the kitchen, phone in hand, her face pale with anger. She had just read the message while standing next to Colton in the kitchen. Her steps were quick and decisive. The entire living room fell silent, and even the Christmas music from the speaker seemed to grow quieter. As soon as she reached Meredith, Mom slammed the phone down on the table with a loud bang. Then she looked straight into my sister's face, her voice so cold I felt chills run down my spine. She said to Meredith, "You explained to me. The old lady has someone to wait on her now. You wrote that, didn't you?" Faced with Mom's fury, Meredith sat up straight, the smile fading from her lips. She stammered back, "Mom, I was joking." Hearing that answer, Mom nodded slowly, the kind of nod everyone knows means she's trying to contain her anger. Then she laughed, a dry, bitter laugh, and continued, "Joking. You're 32 years old, living off your brother's apartment, leeching off this family for how many years, and you think you have the right to joke like that?" Her voice started getting louder. Mom stepped closer, pointing her finger at Meredith's face. "You called your mother an old lady. You called your mother's grandson a bastard. In front of 15 family members." Meredith stammered, trying to defend herself to Mom. "Mom, I was just joking. Everyone misunderstood what I meant." Before she could finish, Mom slammed her hand on the table, making the glasses shake, and yelled at my sister, "Shut up, stupid joke." The whole living room froze. Aunt Martha, who was holding a wine glass, put it down. Uncle Harold stood up and backed away. I had never seen Mom lose her composure like that in my entire 37 years of life. After the yell, Mom took a deep breath. Then her voice changed from screaming to whispering, and that kind of whisper was even scarier than the yelling. "I held Colton from the moment he was born. I stayed up nights when Colton had a fever. I picked up my grandson from school whenever Bennett was busy with projects. Colton has called me grandma since he spoke his first words." She paused, tears starting to fall, but not tears of weakness, but tears of anger down to the bone. Mom gritted her teeth and asked Meredith, "And you? What have you done? What have you contributed to this family besides sitting there judging others?" Right after Mom's words, Dad stood up from the armchair by the fireplace. He walked over to stand next to Mom and put his hand on her shoulder. He looked at Meredith, his eyes cold as ice in a Colorado winter, and said to my sister, "All these years I stayed quiet because I thought you were just thoughtless. that you'd understand eventually. I was wrong. You're not thoughtless. You're evil. Faced with Dad's accusation, Meredith started crying, the crying I'd seen 100 times whenever she caused trouble and got caught. She turned to look at me, her voice trembling, pleading, "Bennett, say something. I stepped forward, stood right in front of her, cut her off immediately, my voice ice cold. What do you want me to say? I warned you 8 months ago, right in this house's kitchen. I made it clear that if you touched my son one more time, don't blame me. Did you think I was kidding?" Right after that, Dad continued, his voice still steady but heavy as stone. "Stella is Stella's business. If she was messing around, that's her problem. But Colton is our grandson. The kid does not fault adult business." While the whole family was closing in on her, Meredith looked around the living room searching for an ally. Mom's sister, Aunt Anna, turned her face away, pretending to look out the window where snow was falling lightly outside. Uncle Harold shook his head in disappointment and went out to the porch to smoke. Not a single person stood by her side. And when she realized she was utterly alone, Meredith suddenly switched from crying to screaming. She shot up, her face red with rage, yelling at the whole family. Why? Why is everyone defending that kid? Stella slept with how many men? Who knows whose kid he is? Why won't anyone face the truth? The moment her words ended, I felt blood rushing to my face. I stepped so close I was almost touching my sister's face. My voice low, saying to Meredith word by word, "Say it one more time. Just one more sentence about my son. I swear to God. Today will be your last day, Meredith." Faced with that threat, Meredith went silent, shrinking back. She saw something in my eyes, something she'd never seen before. Right when the tension reached its peak, Dad spoke up, his voice calm and terrifying. He ordered Meredith, "Tonight you sleep at a hotel. Tomorrow morning we'll talk to you. But right now, I don't want to see your face in this house." After Dad's words, Mom nodded, wiping her tears. She added to Meredith, "Go. Before I say things I'll regret." Meredith stood up, her legs shaking, trying to grab her purse. But before she could walk away, she still tried to salvage the situation. Her voice weak and pleading to Mom. "Mom, it's snowing outside. Mom cut her off, her voice ice cold, replying to Meredith, "You'd better leave before I forget you're my daughter." That sentence was like a slap. Meredith stood there, her face pale, then quietly grabbed her purse and walked to the door. No one saw her off. No one said another word. Right when the door closed behind Meredith, Colton ran out from the kitchen because he heard the noise. The kid stood at the kitchen door, his eyes confused, looking around the living room, seeing Grandma crying, seeing Grandpa's face red with anger, seeing Dad breathing heavily. He walked over next to me, tugged gently on my sleeve, and asked quietly, "Dad, what happened? Why did Aunt Meredith leave? Why is Grandma crying?" Seeing my son, all the anger in me melted away, replaced by a sharp pain in my chest. The 9-year-old kid had just finished washing some dishes with Grandma, hadn't even had time to understand why the cheerful Christmas night suddenly turned into this. I knelt to his level, trying to keep my voice calm. I said to Colton, "It's nothing, son. Aunt Meredith had something to do and had to leave. Let's stay here a bit longer with Grandpa and Grandma, then go home, okay?" Right after that, Mom walked over, hugged Colton tight, her voice choked up, saying to the kid, "I'm sorry, sweetie. I love you. I always love you. Remember that. Don't ever forget." Colton nodded obediently and didn't ask for more. The kid's eyes then were the eyes of a child who was accustomed to not receiving explanations, accustomed to accepting things he didn't understand. And that made my heart hurt more than any of Meredith's insults. An hour later, I drove Colton back to our apartment in the Highlands neighborhood, Denver. The I-25 road was deserted, snow falling lightly covering both sides of the road. Colton sat in the back seat, quietly looking out the window for a long time, then suddenly asked me, "Dad, what does bastard mean? I heard people saying it earlier." Hearing my son's question, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tight it hurt. I looked at the kid through the rearview mirror, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. Then I answered, "That's a horrid word that decent people never use. And you're not like that. You're my son, forever. No one has the right to say otherwise." Colton nodded, then turned to watch the snow falling outside the window. The kid didn't ask more, but I knew that question would stick with my son for a long time, like an invisible scar that his aunt had just carved into my child's soul. 2 days later, I made the decision I had warned about 8 months earlier. After that night, the family group chat with 15 people was permanently deleted by Mom, who had always believed there needed to be a shared space to connect family members. But maybe she realized that some things, once broken, can't be fixed with a few goodnight messages. As for me, I'm not sure if my sister returned to the apartment on Downing Street after that night, the place I bought as an investment, but she stayed there for almost 2 years without paying a dime in rent. And honestly, I didn't care anymore either. The only thing I needed to do was keep her away from my son. Throughout the 2 days off after Christmas, my parents constantly video called Colton. Maybe they were afraid the kid would think Grandpa and Grandma were mad at him, too. Luckily, Colton could feel his grandparents' love. Every time they talked, the kid grinned, showing off his new Christmas toys, as if that night had never happened. Maybe that was how my son healed himself through his grandparents' love. As for me, on the morning of December 27th, I called a locksmith to the apartment and had all the locks changed. I had warned her. She didn't listen. Now it was time to follow through on my words. At precisely 10 in the morning, my phone rang. When I picked up, Meredith's panicked voice came through. She asked me, "Bennett, why won't the door lock open?" I calmly replied to her, "I changed the locks. You have 2 weeks to move your stuff. When you need to get in to take things, call me." Silent for a few seconds, then Meredith asked me again, like she couldn't believe her ears. "You're kicking me out over one joke message?" I sighed and answered her, "I warned you. You promised you wouldn't say anything more. You lied to me for 8 months." And just as I predicted, Meredith switched from begging to blaming faster than changing TV channels. She raised her voice and said to me, "You're just too sensitive. Everyone knows what Stella was like." I hung up. Not another word. After I officially cut her off, Mom called to tell me about it. Meredith had called both Dad and Mom, crying and begging to come home to Colorado Springs. But my parents were just like me. Once they got angry, there was no backing down. For the first time in her life, Meredith was utterly alone. No brother, no parents, no one at all. She was like a pet bird raised in a cage her whole life, now released into the wild forest without knowing how to find food. Meredith moved out of the apartment in early January. She disappeared from my life without a word of goodbye. I thought that was the end, that we'd each go our separate ways. I was wrong. 6 months later, life would teach her a lesson that none of us could teach. After Meredith moved out, the apartment on Downing Street was quickly rented again for $1,800 a month. I used that money to build a college fund for Colton. I should have done this 2 years ago, but back then, I was busy taking care of my sister who didn't know how to say thank you. The moment the apartment door closed with the new tenant, a new chapter in my life and my son's began. As for my sister's life, it went into free fall. In the 6 months that followed, I didn't contact Meredith. But news about her still reached me through relatives and Mom, like scattered pieces of a picture gradually falling apart. She rented a room in the Aurora suburbs, the cheapest area in Denver. The room was so cramped you could barely turn around, with thin walls where you could clearly hear neighbors fighting every night. She worked full-time at the nail salon, standing for 10 hours a day, earning a salary barely enough to pay rent and buy cheap food. From someone who lived rent-free for almost 2 years, now she had to count every dollar to get by. And of course, she still didn't forget to post Facebook statuses. Stuff like when your own family turns their back on you over one joke. No one in the family commented. Not a single person. I thought to myself, she still hadn't learned anything. While I was busy watching my sister's collapse from afar, right in my and my son's apartment, another wound was quietly bleeding that I had no idea about. I thought Colton was fine. The kid still went to school regularly, still laughed and joked with friends, still showed off to me whenever he got good grades. Kids forget quickly, I told myself. I was utterly wrong. One night in March, when Colton fell asleep at his desk, I went into his room to carry him to bed. Under the desk lamp, the kid's diary was open. Usually, I never read my son's diary, but that night, my eyes accidentally glanced over those scribbled lines. What was written there left me speechless. The kid wrote about the word bastard. about questions he didn't know who to ask, about Christmas night, when Colton stood behind the kitchen door, hearing everything the adults said to each other. He understood it all, but Colton kept it inside, didn't tell anyone. Every day, I still asked about my son, still thought everything was normal. But how could I know? His aunt had carved a wound into my child's soul that the naked eye couldn't see. The other end was silent for a whole minute. Nobody knew what to say. We adults, even though we tried to protect Colton, couldn't erase what the kid had heard that night. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to explain to my son the cruel words adults often use to hurt each other. I just learned to spend more time with him. On weekends, I took Colton to orphanages to volunteer. On the way home, I told the kid about adopted children, about families without blood ties but who loved each other more than blood relatives. I didn't know if Colton understood what I was trying to convey. I just learned to try and hope. Then one evening in May, during dinner for just the two of us, Colton suddenly put down his spoon. He looked at me, his eyes clear but unusually serious, then asked me, "Dad, I'm your son. That's always true, right, Dad?" Hearing that question, my throat tightened. I pushed back my chair and stood up, walked over and hugged the kid, rubbing his head and saying to Colton, "Yes, absolutely, forever. No one can change that." Colton nodded, then continued eating as if he'd just finished the most normal conversation in the world. But washing dishes after dinner was the moment I'll never forget. Colton stood next to me, helping dry plates, quiet for a while, then looked up and said to me, "You don't need to try so hard, Dad. I know you love me. I love you too." In that moment, I realized my son had grown up much more than I thought. He was only 9, but already knew how to heal his own wounds, and even knew how to comfort his dad, too. I turned away, pretending to dry my hands on a towel, so Colton wouldn't see my eyes stinging. In the months that followed, life for my son and me gradually returned to normal. I thought that when Colton's heart was healed, all the storms had passed. I thought the story about Meredith was closed, that she would pick herself up and live her life somewhere out there. But 6 months after that fateful Christmas night, a call from Mom in July changed everything. Mom called me at 9 o'clock on a July evening. Her voice was broken. She only said one sentence to me, "Come home right now. Something happened." Then she hung up. I was really panicked. In my head, hundreds of worst-case scenarios ran through. Dad had a heart attack. Mom was in an accident. The house was on fire. I called back, but no one answered. I woke Colton up, carried the kid to the car, then drove like crazy to Colorado Springs. When I parked in front of my parents' house on Nevada Avenue, I saw that the living room lights were still on. I carried the drowsy Colton into the house, put the kid on the sofa, then went to find my parents. And I saw Meredith. She was sitting at the dining table, thinner than the last time I saw her, pale, her hair messy. But what left me speechless wasn't her haggard appearance. It was the baby bump that was starting to show clearly under the loose t-shirt. I stood there, couldn't say a word. Mom was sitting next to Meredith, her eyes red and puffy. Dad was standing by the window, looking out into the darkness outside, his back more hunched than the last time I saw him. After a moment of silence, I turned to look at Mom and asked, "What's going on?" Mom sighed. She looked at me and said, "Your sister is 5 months pregnant." This afternoon, Meredith knocked on the door asking to come home. I turned to Meredith, tried to keep my voice calm, and asked her, "Who's the baby's father?" Meredith hung her head, didn't dare look at me. She was silent for a very long time, so long I thought she didn't hear the question. Then she opened her mouth, her voice as quiet as a mosquito, replying to me, "I don't know." I stood there, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. The person who once humiliated a 9-year-old child for suspecting the kid wasn't her brother's biological son, was now carrying a baby in her belly. And she didn't know who the father was. If this were a movie, the audience would say the screenwriter was over the top. But this was real life, and real life is sometimes more ironic than any film could be. Dad was still standing with his back turned, looking out the window. He sighed, the sigh of a father who was too tired of his 30-something daughter who still refused to grow up. Then he turned around, walked to the dining table, looked at Meredith and asked, "What are you planning to do with the baby?" Meredith lifted her head, tears streaming down her cheeks, and she looked at Dad and answered, "I want to keep it." I can't give up the baby. Dad nodded slowly. Then he looked at Mom. The two exchanging glances the way they'd done for 40 years of living together. Without words, they understood each other. Mom stood up. She walked to face Meredith, looked straight into my sister's eyes and said, "You can stay here, but there are 3 conditions. 1, you keep the baby and raise it properly. 2, you have to apologize to your brother and Colton. Really apologize, not just go through the motions. 3, you never call any child a bastard again, including the baby in your belly." Meredith nodded repeatedly, tears flowing non-stop. Dad continued. He looked at Meredith and said, his voice deep and slow, "The baby in your belly is innocent. It didn't choose how it was conceived. Just like Colton didn't choose to leave his mother. Do you understand?" Hearing this, Meredith sobbed uncontrollably. She collapsed her head on the table, her shoulders shaking in waves. This time, it wasn't the crying to shift blame, nor were the tears used to manipulate, as so many times before. This time, she cried because she finally understood what she had refused to acknowledge for so many years. That night, Colton and I slept over at my parents' house. I lay on the old bed in my childhood room, looking up at the familiar ceiling, and wondered what tomorrow would be like. Before going to sleep, Mom stopped by my room. She sat on the edge of the bed, took my hand, and said, "We're not condoning what Meredith did, but Meredith is still our daughter, and the baby in Meredith's belly is our grandchild. We can't close the door." I nodded. I understood. That was what my parents had always taught us since we were little. Parents' love for their children is unconditional. No matter how wrong a child is, the home door stays open. Even though that door might close for a while to teach the child a lesson, it will never be locked forever. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Colton playing with his toy cars in the living room. The kid was making engine noises, utterly oblivious to the heavy atmosphere that had settled over the house the night before. I found him on the carpet, lining up his cars in perfect rows, just as he always did when trying to make sense of things. When he saw me, Colton looked up and asked, "Dad, why is Aunt Meredith here? And why does she look different?" I sat down on the floor next to him, picking up one of his cars. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that his aunt, who had hurt him so deeply, was now in the same situation she had accused him of being in? How do you tell a child that sometimes life teaches lessons in the cruelest ways possible? "Aunt Meredith is going to have a baby," I said, "and she needs Grandpa and Grandma's help right now." Colton nodded, processing this information the way kids do, accepting it as just another fact about the adult world that didn't always make sense. Then he asked, "Is the baby going to live here too?" "Yes, buddy." For a while, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "The baby won't have a dad living here, will it?" The innocence of that observation hit me like a punch to the gut. My 9-year-old son, who had been called a bastard by the woman now carrying a child with no known father, was already understanding the parallels without judgment. Later that morning, Mom asked me to bring Colton to the kitchen while she talked to Meredith alone in the living room. Through the thin walls, we could hear a muffled conversation, then crying. When Mom finally called us back in, Meredith was standing by the window, her face blotchy and swollen from tears. She turned when we entered, and for the first time in years, I saw something different in her eyes. Not the defiance, not the self-righteousness, not even the fear. It was a shame. Real, deep shame. Meredith walked over to where Colton stood beside me. She got down on one knee, putting herself at his eye level, and said, "Colton, I need to say something to you. What I said about you at Christmas was wrong. Really, really wrong. You're not what I called you. You're Bennett's son, and you're Grandpa and Grandma's grandson, and you're a good kid who didn't deserve those words." Her voice cracked as she continued. "I was angry about things that had nothing to do with you, and I took it out on you because I was mean, and I'm sorry." Colton looked at her for a long moment, then at me, then back at her. In that kid's wise beyond his years way, he said, "Okay, thank you for saying sorry." Then, because he was still just a 9-year-old, he asked, "Can I go play now?" After Colton left the room, Meredith turned to me. The apology she gave me was more extended, more detailed, and full of explanations about her jealousy and insecurity. But honestly, I stopped listening after the first few sentences. The damage had been done, and words couldn't undo it. What mattered now was making sure it never happened again. As I drove back to Denver that afternoon, Colton fell asleep in the back seat. I kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, this resilient little person who had weathered a storm that would have broken many adults. 6 months later, Meredith gave birth to a daughter she named Hope. And watching my sister hold that baby for the first time, seeing the fierce protectiveness that instantly consumed her, I finally understood that sometimes the universe has its own way of teaching us the lessons we refuse to learn any other way. The little girl who had no known father became the most protected child in our family. And the woman who had once used cruel words about parentage never spoke anything but love over her daughter. Sometimes karma doesn't come as punishment. Sometimes it comes as understanding. Nearly a year has passed. I'm sitting in my parents' living room, the same room where everything exploded last year. But this year, everything is different. Colton, now 10 years old, is sitting next to little Rosie's crib. The kid is watching his baby cousin sleep, occasionally humming songs he learned at school. Whenever Rosie stirs, Colton gently reaches out to pat her, whispering to her, "Shoo, I'm here, go to sleep." Meredith is in the kitchen helping Mom prepare dinner. For the first time in her life, she's proactively doing housework instead of sitting around scrolling through her phone and judging others. I can hear the two of them talking, soft laughter echoing, sounds that this kitchen had been missing for the past year. Dad is fumbling with the newly bought Christmas tree. He's untangling lights while grumbling because the electrical wires are all twisted up. Christmas isn't here yet, but this year, this house already has a tiny little gift that cries loudly whenever she's hungry. No one mentions the past. No one brings up last year's message. And most importantly, no one calls any child a bastard anymore. Looking around the living room, I suddenly think about the journey of the past year. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. I still remember every word in that Christmas night message last year. But forgiveness is choosing not to let the past define the future. It's allowing people, including yourself, the chance to start over. If you're staying silent while someone hurts your child or your loved ones, stop and think. Silence doesn't protect anyone. If you've ever said cruel words to someone, especially children, remember that it's never too late to apologize. Some people ask me if karma is real. I don't know. I know that life has a way of teaching us lessons that loved ones can't teach. It took Meredith almost a year and a pregnancy to understand what she should have understood long ago. Never call a child a bastard because you don't know what situation life will put you in. What do you think? Should I completely forgive Meredith? Were my parents right to take her back? Let me know in the comments. If the story touched you, please subscribe to the channel and share. Thanks for listening. I look forward to seeing you again. If your 8-year-old son used his own body to save his 14-month-old cousin, then got pointed at and yelled at by the baby's mom demanding he apologize for making her kid fall, what would you do? That's what happened to my son this summer. My brother-in-law swore he saw my kid push the baby down with his own eyes. But the truth behind that testimony shook our entire family. And my sister's marriage will probably never be the same. I want to tell you the story from the beginning. But before I get into the details, thanks for choosing our story today. Hope you keep your heart warm and peaceful this Christmas season. Hello everyone. I'm Brennan Cole, 35 years old. I'm a truck driver in Seattle, and the story I'm telling you today happened this past July when I took my son to visit my parents in California. I've been driving trucks for 8 years. Before the divorce, I ran long hauls from Seattle to Los Angeles, crossing the I-5, each trip lasting a whole week. Pay was way better than now, but the price I paid was being away from home all the time. 2 years ago, I found out my wife was cheating. She met another man while I was away. When I confronted her, she didn't apologize, just looked me straight in the eyes and said, "I need a husband who's actually home, Brennan. Not some shadow who shows up for a few days then disappears again." The court ruled I got custody because she didn't want it. That's right, she didn't want Sawyer. To her, our son was just part of the old life she tried to leave behind. After the divorce, I switched to local day runs around the Seattle area so I could be home every night with my kid. Income dropped to about $55,000 a year, just enough to cover rent on a 2-bedroom apartment and raise Sawyer, but never comfortable. That's the price I was willing to pay to avoid missing another day with my son. Sawyer's 8 this year. That kid is everything I've got. After his mom left, Sawyer became quieter, more withdrawn. He didn't cry, didn't ask why mom wasn't around anymore. He just went silent, and that silence hurt my heart more than any crying could. Sawyer's most immense joy is watching wildlife shows on the Discovery Channel. That kid can sit for hours watching episodes about what to do when you encounter bears, when you meet wolves, and when you face wild dogs. I used to think it was just standard kid stuff. I never imagined that knowledge would save my niece's life. This summer, I decided to take 2 weeks off to bring Sawyer to visit his grandparents in Willow Creek, a small town outside Sacramento. This was the first trip after the divorce where I felt calm enough to face my family. For 2 years, I avoided going home because I didn't want to hear questions about my broken marriage, didn't want to see the pity in my parents' eyes, and especially, I didn't want to see my sister Vivian. Vivian is 7 years older than I, a successful lawyer in Portland, making 3 times what I make. She's never said straight out that she looks down on me, but I can feel it in every glance, every comment. Every time we meet, she always finds ways to subtly remind me that I'm just a truck driver, that I don't have a college degree, that my marriage failing was something everyone saw coming. She calls it caring, but I know every word she says is contempt wrapped up in family concern. Still, I decided to go because Sawyer needed to see his grandparents. Because Dad just got diagnosed with diabetes, and I wanted to be there for him. And maybe, part of me still hoped things would be different. The first 2 days in Willow Creek went smoother than I'd imagined. My dad, Franklin Cole, even though he had to use a cane because of his weak knees, still insisted on taking Sawyer to the backyard to show him how to identify different fruit trees. My mom, Donna, kept bustling around the kitchen baking chocolate chip cookies, Sawyer's favorite. Every time the kid took a bite, his eyes lit up, and Mom would smile with pure satisfaction. For the first time in 2 years, I saw my son laugh for real, the kind of laugh I thought had disappeared along with my broken marriage. On the second evening, while I was sitting on the porch drinking beer with Dad, my phone buzzed. Vivian was calling. She announced that tomorrow morning, she'd drive down from Portland with her husband and daughter and demanded that I stay at least until the weekend so the whole family could be together. Her tone wasn't asking for my opinion. It was announcing her decision. I was so used to that voice that I just gave her a quick answer to get it over with. Dad glanced at me when I hung up. He didn't say anything, just took a sip of his beer and looked out into the night. His silence said more than any words could. On the third morning, Vivian arrived with her husband, Clint Hartley, and their daughter, Chloe, who was just 14 months old. Chloe was the result of years of Vivian's IVF attempts, the precious treasure she cherished more than her own life. Grandma and Grandpa were absolutely thrilled to see their granddaughter. Mom held Chloe and wouldn't let go, gushing about how the baby had eyes exactly like Vivian's when she was little. Dad sat next to Sawyer on the porch swing, his hand on the kid's shoulder, telling stories about how he used to work as a food packer, struggling but still managing to raise 2 kids properly. Watching the 2 grandkids gathered around their grandparents, I quietly thought maybe everything would be okay. Maybe Vivian would be too busy caring for her daughter to scrutinize my life. This vacation may be a new beginning for the whole family. But life had taught me a lesson. Every time I start hoping, that's when everything's about to fall apart. Near noon that day, I was getting ready to take my parents to Henderson Clinic on Oak Street for their follow-up appointments. Dad needed his regular blood sugar check, and Mom needed new allergy medication because the old stuff stopped working. Before leaving, I sat down next to Sawyer on the sofa, put my hand on his shoulder and told my son, I'm taking Grandma and Grandpa to their checkups, and I'll probably be back in about 2 hours. You stay home and play nicely with Chloe. Don't run around wild, okay? Sawyer looked up from the wildlife book that he'd brought from Seattle, nodded and answered, I know, Dad. Don't worry. I ruffled his hair and stood up. Vivian was standing on the porch holding Chloe. She looked at me and waved confidently. Just go. I've got this. What could happen with 2 little kids? Clint was sitting on the porch chair, eyes glued to his phone, muttering something I couldn't make out. I glanced at him, a bit hesitant. Vivian seemed to read my thoughts. She nodded toward her husband and added, Clint's here too. 2 adults watching 2 kids. What could go wrong? I nodded, didn't think anything more of it, and I trusted her. And that was my first mistake of the day. The checkup lasted longer than 2 hours because the clinic was packed with patients. Dad had to wait almost an hour just to be called in for his blood sugar test, and then Mom had to wait even longer to get her new prescription. When we left the clinic, the clock was already showing nearly 2 in the afternoon. On the way home, I drove slowly along Willow Creek Road. The afternoon sun filtered through the oak trees lining both sides of the road, creating dancing streaks of light on the windshield. Dad sat in the passenger seat, his eyes drowsy after a tiring morning at the clinic. Mom sat in the back, clutching her bag of medicine, occasionally humming an old tune softly. I thought about Sawyer, wondering what he was doing, probably still reading his book, or maybe playing in the yard with Chloe under Vivian's watch. I smiled to myself, calculating that when I got home, I'd invite him to walk to the ice cream shop on Main Street, a treat for being good all morning. But that ice cream would never be bought. When the car turned into the driveway leading to my parents' house, I could already see the familiar red roof of the old house rising above the trees from a distance. Everything was quiet, peaceful, until I heard screaming Tear through the afternoon. You pushed her down and you're still denying it? Vivian's voice echoed across the yard like thunder. I hadn't even turned off the engine, hadn't even understood what was happening, but a father's instinct made me yank open the car door and rush in. Mom called out anxiously behind me, "Brennan, what's going on? Honey?" I didn't answer. My feet moved faster than my brain could think. My heart was pounding wildly, blood rushing to my face. I knew who that screaming was aimed at. I knew, and it made me want to lose my mind. The scene in front of me made my steps freeze in the middle of the yard. Sawyer stood alone on the grass, small and lonely like a sapling in a storm. His head was hanging down, hair falling over his face. His hands were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. His whole body was shaking in waves, as if he was using all his strength not to collapse. Standing in front of my son was Vivian. She towered over him by so much, and she was using all of that height, all the authority of a successful lawyer to crush an 8-year-old child. Her index finger was pointing straight at Sawyer's face like a spear of accusation. Her face was purple with rage, veins bulging in her neck, eyes blazing with fury. Clint stood next to his wife, trying to put on the serious look of an adult handling a situation. But his eyes kept glancing down at the phone in his hand, where the screen was still lit with colorful candies from Candy Crush frozen mid-game. He didn't even bother to turn it off. On the wooden chair on the porch, I could see Chloe sitting and sniffling, a teddy bear band-aid stuck to her knee. She'd stopped crying, just occasionally letting out a minor hiccup. Vivian spun around when she heard my footsteps. She didn't lower her voice at all, actually got louder, like she wanted the whole neighborhood to hear. "You're back just in time, Brennan. Your son just pushed Chloe down and made her knee bleed. I have an eyewitness." She jerked her head toward Clint like she was summoning a witness in a courtroom. Clint quickly looked up from his phone, his voice suspiciously confident. "That's right. I was sitting right here. I saw him push her clear as day." I stared straight into my brother-in-law's eyes. He avoided my gaze, his thumb unconsciously stroking the edge of his phone. I didn't need any more proof to know he was lying. A man glued to games all morning could see what exactly? Behind me, my parents had made it into the yard. Mom rushed straight to Sawyer's side, kneeling to his level, her hands cupping her grandson's face, her voice choking. "Sawyer, look up, honey, look at Grandma." Sawyer slowly lifted his face. His eyes were red, but there were no tears. He'd swallowed them all down. His lips were pressed so tight they were pale, as if he was afraid that if he opened his mouth, he'd burst into tears in front of everyone. Dad walked over with his cane, standing between Vivian and Sawyer like a wall. His voice was deep and slow, but I could hear the anger being held back in every word. "Vivian, lower your voice. This is your parents' home, not your courtroom." Vivian blinked, seeming surprised that Dad dared to cut her off, but she quickly regained her composure, took a deep breath, and began presenting with the tone of a lawyer reading an indictment. I looked at my son huddled against his grandmother, his frightened look cutting into my heart like a knife. Then I looked at Clint, this man standing there with his phone glued to his hand like a body part. My jaw clenched, my temples started twitching. I was about to step over to my kid, pull him into my arms, and ask if he was okay. But Vivian was faster. She cut through everything with her ice-cold voice, beginning to present the case like she was accusing a criminal in front of a jury. The moment I was about to move toward my son, Vivian grabbed my arm and yanked me back. She pointed at Chloe sitting and sniffling on the porch chair, her voice shrill. "Look, Brennan, look at my daughter. Her knee is bleeding, your son did that." I jerked my arm away from her, my voice turning cold. "Let go of me." But Vivian didn't give me a chance. She stepped between me and Sawyer, hands on her hips, beginning to present the case like she was reading an indictment to a jury. I let Chloe play in the yard, asked Clint to watch her while I went inside to get water. Less than 2 minutes, you hear me, less than 2 minutes. I came back out and saw my daughter lying on the ground crying, her knee bleeding, and your son standing right next to her. While Vivian was talking, Dad had walked over to the porch chair with his cane. He bent down and picked up Chloe, one hand supporting her back, the other patting gently, his voice soothing. "Shoo, sweetie, Grandpa's here, you're okay." Chloe nestled against his chest, her tiny finger clutching his shirt collar, her hiccups gradually getting quieter. I stepped past Vivian and walked straight to where Clint was standing. He backed up half a step when he saw me approaching, his finger hurriedly turning off his phone screen, but it was too late. I looked straight into his eyes, asking slowly, word by word, "You said you saw it clearly. So, how did you see my son push Chloe down? Did he use one hand or 2 hands? Did he push her shoulder or her back?" Clint swallowed, his eyes darting left then right, looking anywhere except at me. His voice stammered. I looked up right when the kid fell. Sawyer was standing right there, so, right when she fell, I cut him off, my voice dropping. "Meaning you didn't see anyone push anyone. You just saw her already on the ground, right?" Clint opened his mouth to say something, but only meaningless mumbles came out. His face turned red, then pale, precisely like a kid caught sneaking candy. He saw nothing at all. He was blaming an 8-year-old to avoid getting yelled at by his wife for playing games instead of watching the kids. Vivian immediately jumped in, her voice sharp. "Don't try to deflect. Besides your son, who else was there? He pushed Chloe because he's jealous, clear as daylight. Since we got here, everyone's been paying attention to Chloe, holding Chloe, playing with Chloe, while he sits in the corner reading. He got mad, so he took it out on her." Clint grabbed onto this like a lifeline, quickly nodding along. "That's right, I've been noticing too. The kid keeps looking at Chloe with weird eyes." I spun around to face him, my voice grinding out each word. "You've been noticing? You've had your eyes glued to that phone from morning till now. What could you notice? Do you even know what color shirt my son is wearing today?" Clint opened his mouth but couldn't get any words out. He glanced at Sawyer, then looked away, his head hanging down. I turned around and walked straight to where Sawyer was standing huddled next to my mom. She was still holding his shoulders, her eyes looking at me full of worry. I knelt in front of my kid, both hands on his shoulders, feeling him shaking under my palms. I tried to keep my voice calm. "Sawyer, look at me. Tell Dad what happened. Just tell the truth, I'm listening." Sawyer slowly lifted his face. His eyes were red, eyelids wet, but he bit his lip hard to keep the tears from falling. His voice trembled. "I didn't push her, Dad. I swear I didn't push her. I believe you," I said immediately. "I believe you. Now, can you tell me exactly what happened?" Sawyer took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling. "I was sitting on the porch reading when I saw a dog run into the yard. It looked like the pit bull I saw on TV. Brown with white spots on its chest. It looked really mean. It was running straight toward Chloe." He paused, swallowed hard, and continued. "I was scared it would bite her, so I ran out to pull her inside. I grabbed her hand, but she tripped and fell. I didn't push her, Dad. I just wanted to save her." Behind me, Vivian let out a mocking laugh, speaking like she was cross-examining in court. "A dog? Really a dog? Great job, Brennan. Your son's really good at making up stories." She crossed her arms, voice triumphant. "Our family's never owned a dog. Mom's allergic to dog hair. Everyone in the neighborhood knows that. For 30 years I've lived here, I've never seen any stray dog wander into our yard." Right as she finished, Clint chimed in, his voice suddenly bold. "I was sitting on the porch the whole time. There was no dog at all. If a dog ran into the yard, I would have seen it. My son said there was a dog. My sister insisted there couldn't be a dog. My brother-in-law testified, even though his eyes never left his phone screen all morning. I looked into Sawyer's eyes, searching for any sign of deception. But all I saw was fear, hurt, and the desperation of a child telling the truth that no one would believe. I believed my son. But right now, my belief carried no weight against Vivian's accusations. Right at that moment, Dad's voice rang out, deep and firm. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon. The July sun in California was pouring down on the yard, as if it wanted to burn everything up. We stood in the middle of the grass in front of the porch, sweat running down our backs. But nobody bothered looking for shade. The anger was hotter than the sun outside. I looked over at my parents. They stood there, 2 people in their 60s, watching the children they'd given birth to and raised tear each other apart right in their own yard. Dad's face was tense, and Mom's eyes were red like she was about to cry. They were probably really stuck. If they defended Sawyer, they'd look like they were playing favorites with their grandson. But if they stayed silent, they'd let an 8-year-old get wrongly accused with nobody protecting him. But I knew my parents. They weren't the type to stand by and watch injustice unfold before their eyes. Dad slowly set Chloe down on the porch chair, patted her hair once, then walked out into the middle of the yard with his cane. He stood between Vivian and Sawyer like a wall, then turned to his eldest daughter, his voice dropping, "Vivian, let's go inside and talk." Standing out in the sun, everyone's hot, everyone's losing their cool. Vivian shook her head firmly, brushing off Dad's suggestion. "No need to go inside. I want to settle this right here." He pushed her down. "He needs to apologize." Dad turned to look at his son-in-law, frowning as he asked directly, "Clint, you said you saw it. So did you see Sawyer push Chloe? Or did you see Chloe already fallen?" Clint fumbled under the blazing sun, sweat beading on his forehead, stammering. "Well, Sawyer was standing right next to her. Who else was there?" After hearing that answer, Dad sighed and shook his head, looking at Clint with disappointed eyes. "Standing next to someone is different from pushing them down. You're an adult. You should be able to tell the difference." Meanwhile, Mom was still with Sawyer. She held his shoulders tighter, then knelt to his eye level, using her sleeve to wipe the sweat from his forehead. Her voice gentle. "Sawyer, are you sure you saw a dog? Or did you mistake something else?" Sawyer nodded hard, his eyes looking straight into his grandmother's, his voice firm. "I really saw it, Grandma. I'm not lying." My parents looked at each other. I knew what they were thinking. Sawyer wasn't the type of kid to make up stories, but the pitbull story sounded too unbelievable. There were a few houses around here that had dogs, but they were all gentle breeds like golden retrievers or beagles. Nobody dared to keep a pitbull because that breed had a reputation for being vicious. Many states even banned them. A pitbull showing up in this peaceful neighborhood sounded like fiction. Mom stroked her grandson's hair, her voice soft as a whisper. "Okay, let's calm down first. We'll figure this out slowly." My parents were trying to find the truth in the brutal heat and conflicting testimonies. But Vivian didn't need to wait. The moment Vivian completely lost her patience. She stepped forward, standing right in front of Sawyer, her voice like she was pronouncing a sentence. Slowly, "What? The evidence is crystal clear. Sawyer, apologize to Chloe right now." Faced with his aunt's demand, Sawyer stepped back, his back touching Mom's legs. He shook his head, his voice trembling but clear. "I won't apologize. I didn't do anything wrong." Vivian gritted her teeth at the refusal, her face turning purple, yelling, "You didn't do anything wrong? You pushed her down until she bled, then made up a story about a dog. Apologize right now." Sawyer still shook his head, his eyes looking straight at his aunt. "I didn't push her. I saved her. I won't apologize because I'm not wrong." In that moment, I felt like my chest was being squeezed. My son, this quiet and often fearful 8-year-old, stood up straight, refusing to confess even as his aunt yelled at him. He wasn't crying, wasn't begging. He just shook his head and held firm to his words. Vivian let out a harsh laugh, turning to look at me with contemptuous eyes. "Brennan, you see this? What kind of way are you raising your kid that he's this disrespectful? Does something wrong. Won't admit it and even argues back with adults. No mom around. So this is what happens." That comment was like a bucket of boiling water thrown right in my face. I stood up, stepped forward to stand between Vivian and my son. My voice dropped, each word grinding through my teeth. What did you just say? Vivian didn't step back. She lifted her chin high, repeating, You heard me clearly. The kid is undisciplined because he doesn't have a mother. That's the truth. Blood rushed to my face. For 2 years, I'd held back enough. Held back from my cheating ex-wife. Held back from coworkers' mockery. Held back from my sister every time we met. But this time she'd gone too far. I turned to my parents, trying to keep my voice calm, asking, Mom, Dad, do we have a security camera in the yard? We could watch it and know exactly what happened. Dad shook his head, his voice regretful. We only have a camera at the front door. Decades living here. Never had a break-in, we didn't think we needed to install more. Vivian laughed triumphantly, saying to me, See? No evidence at all. Just Clint's testimony. And Clint says he pushed her down. I spun around to look at Clint, who was trying to shrink into the corner of the porch. I pointed straight at his face, asking again, You said you saw it, so swear it. Swear in front of the whole family that you saw with your own eyes my son push Chloe. Clint opened his mouth, then closed it, his face going pale. He didn't dare swear. Seeing her husband stay silent, Vivian got even angrier, continuing to yell, Brennan, stop trying to deflect. Your kid did wrong, so he has to take responsibility. That's how people raise children. I took a deep breath, ready to say all the things I'd been holding back for years, that she'd always looked down on me, that she had no right to insult my son, that her husband was a liar. Right then, the neighbor's gate burst open with a bang. Oscar Reyes came running over in panic, his face pale like someone who just witnessed a disaster. Behind him was his wife, Nina, using all her strength to pull a large pit bull on a chain. The dog was brown with white spots on its chest, exactly as Sawyer had described. Vivian stood frozen when she saw the dog. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Oscar was breathing hard and raised both hands apologetically, looking at my parents with guilty eyes. Sorry, Mr. and Mrs. Cole. Bruno broke out of his pen. My son's on vacation in Hawaii, so he left him with us to watch for a few days. We're not used to having dogs. Didn't expect him to dig a hole through the fence. Dad looked at the dog, then at Sawyer, his voice shaking. So there really was a dog. Oscar nodded repeatedly, turning to look at Sawyer, then telling everyone this Bruno bit a delivery guy 6 months ago. My son had to pay over $8,000 in compensation. If he'd bitten the kid, I don't know what would have happened. Nina had just finished chaining the dog to their porch post, and she ran over with her phone in hand, breathing hard as she spoke to everyone. I have video. Our camera caught everything. My son installed cameras for us last year. I was still complaining, saying we didn't need them. Nothing ever happens in this neighborhood for decades. Who knew today it would become evidence? Everyone crowded around to look at the phone screen. I stood right behind Vivian, clearly seeing every detail in the video. Chloe was toddling around on the grass, the wobbly steps of a child just learning to walk. Clint sat on the porch, back against his chair, eyes glued to his phone, finger constantly swiping the screen. Sawyer sat reading in the corner of the porch near the flower bed. Then Bruno appeared. The dog squeezed through a gap under the old wooden fence, charging straight toward Chloe. Clint still had no idea. His eyes were still stuck to the game screen. Sawyer looked up, saw the dog, yelled loudly, but my brother-in-law didn't pay any attention. In an instant, the kid threw down his book and ran quickly to Chloe. He grabbed her hand hard and pulled the baby behind him. Chloe lost her balance and fell, her knee hitting the ground. Bruno moved closer, baring his teeth and growling, just a few steps away from Sawyer. The dog was as big as a calf, its head nearly level with the 8-year-old's chest. But Sawyer didn't run. The kid slowly bent down, eyes never leaving the dog. He picked up a rock the size of his fist from the edge of the flower bed, raised it high above his head, and spread his arms to make himself look bigger. Then he yelled really loud and stomped his feet hard on the ground. Bruno stopped, confused. The dog hesitated for a few seconds, then turned and ran away. Sawyer stayed still, hands still raised high, feet still spread wide, until he was sure the dog was gone entirely. Only then did Vivian run out of the house, and she saw Chloe crying on the ground, with Sawyer standing next to her. Throughout the entire video, Clint never looked up once. The video ended. No one could say a word. I looked at Vivian, her face was deathly pale. Her lips were moving silently, her eyes blinking continuously like she couldn't believe what she'd just seen. Then I looked at Clint. He stood huddled in the corner of the porch, head hanging down, not daring to look at anyone. The phone in his hand now looked like evidence of a criminal. All of Vivian's accusations had collapsed entirely. The video ended, and no one could say a word. I held Sawyer tighter in my arms, feeling him shaking in my embrace. Mom stepped next to us, kneeling to stroke her grandson's hair, tears streaming down her cheeks. Dad still stood, holding Chloe. The little girl had stopped crying at some point. Now she lay peacefully in his arms, having no idea what she'd just escaped from. Vivian stood in stunned silence, looking at the phone screen Nina was holding. Then she slowly turned to look at her husband, her eyes blazing red. The scolding began. She called Clint an irresponsible father, a liar, someone who almost got their daughter killed just because he was busy playing games. Clint stood there taking it, head hanging down, not daring to say half a word. Dad shook his head in disgust, looking at his son-in-law, not bothering to say another word. His disappointed look was heavier than any scolding could be. I whispered in my son's ear, "I'm sorry, Dad, sorry." Sawyer buried his face in my shoulder, for the first time crying out loud since everything happened. Inside, I felt lucky the dog didn't charge and bite, that Sawyer remembered what he'd learned on TV. If not, everything would have been a true nightmare with no end in sight. Oscar and Nina stood nearby, both bowing their heads, apologizing once more, promising to watch the dog more carefully, and then quietly went home. After the neighbors left, Vivian stepped in front of us. She grabbed the kid's shirt, her voice choking as she begged for forgiveness. But my son just buried his face deeper in my shoulder, refusing to look at his aunt. I knew this wound would take a very long time to heal. That afternoon, I knew I couldn't stay another minute. I packed our things and took my son back to Seattle. Before leaving, I talked with my parents on the porch. They understood and accepted it, though I saw Mom's eyes red when she hugged her grandson goodbye. The family vacation they'd been hoping for had ended in pieces. The over 700-mile drive from Willow Creek to our little apartment took nearly 12 hours. In the car, Sawyer and I talked a lot. About limits of tolerance, about how to treat family, about forgiveness. The kid listened, nodding sometimes, asking questions sometimes. He understood things to a degree that broke my heart. When we were almost home, after hesitating many times, I asked, "Are you sad about your aunt?" Sawyer was quietly looking out the window for a long time, then answered, "Yes, I'm really sad. She's a lawyer. She demands evidence from other people, but she convicted me without needing any evidence." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, didn't say another word. In that moment, I realized my son had grown up much more than I thought. Mom called to tell me that my sister's family was also leaving the next morning. Both of us sisters didn't want to keep fighting in front of our elderly parents. That was probably the only thing we agreed on at the time. In the days after, my phone kept getting texts from Vivian. Apologies. Requests to call her nephew. Requests for a chance to make things right. Then handwritten letters came too, her familiar handwriting on white envelopes. Sawyer read them all, but he just folded them up and put them in his drawer. Wounds need time to heal. 2 months passed with video calls from my parents. They didn't mention the past. They just asked about their grandson, talked about the garden, and occasionally sighed when thinking about their children and grandchildren far away. Then one afternoon a month ago, there was a knock on the apartment door. I opened it and stood frozen. Vivian was standing there, holding Chloe in her arms. My successful sister looked worn down, with dark circles under her eyes, and her hair hastily tied up. She wasn't wearing those expensive suits anymore, just an old sweater and faded jeans. Sawyer stood behind me. I thought he'd turn and go to his room and close the door. But no, he stood still, looked at his aunt, waiting. She stepped inside and set Chloe down. The little girl toddled over to hug her cousin's legs, babbling Sawyer's name. The two kids wrapped around each other as if nothing had ever happened. While the kids played, Vivian told me her story. She'd divorced Clint. After that day, she looked at him with different eyes. A man willing to blame an 8-year-old to avoid getting scolded by his wife didn't deserve to be a husband or father. She also talked about herself, about her arrogance, about how she'd treated me all these years. She thought she was innovative and successful, but turns out she was blind in both how she loved and how she saw people. When she asked if I could forgive her, I shook my head and answered, "I'm not the one who needs an apology." Vivian understood. She stood up and walked to where Sawyer was sitting, playing with Chloe. She knelt, took his hands, said through tears, "I'm sorry. I was wrong." Sawyer looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. Just one nod, but I felt my eyes sting. That night she asked to stay. For the first time in over 10 years, the two sisters sat drinking beer together, talking about our lives. No fighting, no needling, just stories and light laughter. The next morning, she video called our parents. When they saw all four of us sitting together on the screen, Mom burst into tears. Dad turned away to wipe his eyes. For older adults, there's nothing more precious than seeing their children and grandchildren in harmony. This Christmas, we're all going back to Willow Creek together. My family isn't perfect. The wounds haven't completely healed, but we're learning how to love each other better. That's the end of my story. If there's anything I want to leave you with, it's this: listen to children before you judge them. Sometimes the truth lies where we least expect it. If you were me, would you forgive your sister? If you were Sawyer, would you forgive your aunt? Leave your comments below. Thanks for listening. See you in the following stories.